Imagine walking into a classroom in 1990. You might find one child with an autism diagnosis among hundreds. Fast forward to today, and that number has exploded to 1 in 36 children. Parents whisper concerns at playgrounds. News headlines trumpet a mysterious epidemic. Social media floods with theories about vaccines, pesticides, processed foods, each claiming to have uncovered the smoking gun behind this apparent explosion in autism rates. But what if we've been asking the wrong question entirely? What if the surge in autism diagnoses isn't about something new happening to humanity, but about humanity finally seeing something that was always there? Consider this. In the 1970s, the estimated autism rate was approximately 1 in 10,000 children. By the mid-1990s, it had risen to 1 in 500. Today, it stands at 1 in 36. That's not a subtle increase. It's a statistical tsunami that demands explanation. But here's where our story takes its first unexpected turn. What looks like a dramatic rise in autism may actually be a dramatic rise in recognition. Dr. Brenda Pierce still remembers the moment this realization hit her. As a developmental psychologist working in Philadelphia's neurodevelopmental clinic, she had just diagnosed a 52-year-old engineer with autism spectrum disorder. He sat in my office and wept, she recalls. Not from sadness, but from profound relief. I always knew I was different, he told me. I just never had a name for it. That engineer had navigated 5 decades of life, college, career, marriage, parenthood, without anyone, including himself, recognizing his neurological differences. How many others like him had been hiding in plain sight throughout human history? This is not just a story about autism. It's about how human understanding shapes what we perceive, how medical and cultural paradigms determine what we count, and how the invisible can suddenly become visible without anything actually changing. It's about one of the most profound shifts in how we understand the human mind, and perhaps, by extension, what it means to be human at all. To understand the apparent explosion in autism rates, we need to travel back to 1943, when a child psychiatrist named Leo Kanner first described a condition he called early infantile autism. Kanner's criteria were exceedingly narrow, focusing primarily on children who showed extreme withdrawal, mutism, and an insistence on sameness. These children were often institutionalized, hidden away from public view and consciousness. For decades afterward, autism remained a rare diagnosis, applied almost exclusively to the most severely affected individuals. Many children who today would receive an autism diagnosis were instead labeled as having childhood schizophrenia, mental retardation, or simply emotional disturbance. Others, particularly those with average or above-average intelligence, received no diagnosis at all. They were just odd, difficult, or eccentric. The first major expansion of the autism concept came from British psychiatrist Lorna Wing in the late 1970s. Wing introduced the idea of the autism spectrum, suggesting that autism features could exist across a wide range of presentations and severity levels. She also brought renewed attention to the work of Hans Asperger, an Austrian pediatrician who, in the 1940s, had described children with normal language development but significant social difficulties and intense specialized interests. Dr. Benjamin Norton, now the director of the Neurodiversity Research Center at Stanford University, was a young psychology student when Wing's work began gaining traction. What Wing did was revolutionary, he explains. She essentially said, "These children aren't just failing to meet some arbitrary standard of normal. They represent a different but equally valid way of experiencing and processing the world." Wing's reconceptualization set the stage for the most significant change in how autism was diagnosed: the introduction of Asperger's syndrome to diagnostic manuals in the 1990s. Suddenly, individuals with normal or advanced language abilities, average or above-average intelligence, but significant social difficulties could receive a formal diagnosis. The effects were immediate and dramatic. Autism rates began climbing sharply. But was this because more people were developing autism, or because more people with autism were being recognized? Professor Catherine Whitman of Johns Hopkins University has spent decades tracking autism diagnostic patterns. The data strongly suggests most of the increase is due to diagnostic substitution and expansion, she explains. We've seen corresponding decreases in diagnoses like intellectual disability and language disorder as autism diagnoses have risen. We're not creating more neurodevelopmental conditions, we're reshuffling how we categorize them. The most compelling evidence comes from retrospective studies. Researchers have gone back to evaluate individuals diagnosed with other conditions in previous decades, finding that many would meet today's criteria for autism. One landmark study reviewed records from a clinic in the 1980s and found that nearly 60% of children previously diagnosed with intellectual disability with features of emotional disturbance would qualify for autism diagnoses under current standards. But diagnostic substitution only explains part of the increase. The remainder reflects something even more profound. We are now recognizing milder forms of autism that previously went completely undetected. Think of it like a telescope getting better resolution, suggests Dr. Norton. The stars were always there in the sky. We just couldn't see them clearly before. Maria Fernandez never understood why her grandfather collected and categorized thousands of vinyl records, arranging them by precise subcategories and becoming distressed when anyone disturbed his system. In school, she was the child who could recite obscure facts about medieval architecture but couldn't understand why other girls suddenly stopped wanting to play with her in 5th grade. I was just Maria, the weird kid who talked too much about cathedrals and got overwhelmed at birthday parties, she recalls. It wasn't until I was watching a documentary about autism at age 34 that something clicked. They were describing me. Maria represents what experts now call the lost generation. Individuals who grew up before broader autism awareness, who went undiagnosed and often struggled without understanding why. Today, at 42, she's a successful architectural historian who received her formal autism diagnosis at age 36. The diagnosis didn't change who I am, she explains, but it gave me context for my experiences. It helped me stop blaming myself for finding certain things difficult that others find easy. Stories like Maria's have become increasingly common as adult autism diagnosis rates rise. They reveal a crucial insight. Autism didn't suddenly appear. It was always present, just unrecognized or called by different names. This realization gained scientific validation through several landmark studies. In 2011, researchers in the United Kingdom conducted a comprehensive autism screening among adults, finding prevalence rates nearly identical to those in children. If autism were truly increasing, one would expect much lower rates in older populations. This suggested that autism has maintained a relatively stable actual prevalence across generations. Even more telling was a 2020 study that examined preserved school records from the 1950s and 1960s. Using modern diagnostic criteria, researchers identified students whose behavioral descriptions strongly indicated autism. The estimated rate, between 1 in 101 in 64, remarkably close to current prevalence estimates. The evidence increasingly points toward autism being much more common throughout history than we realized, explains Dr. Amelia Johnson, neuropsychologist and author of The Invisible Spectrum. We just lacked the framework and language to identify it. This understanding has profound implications. If autism has always been present at roughly current rates, then what we're witnessing isn't an epidemic, it's a revelation. But why did autism remain hidden for so long? The answer reveals something profound about human neurodiversity and how society responds to difference. Barbara Powell discovered she was autistic at age 45, after her son's diagnosis prompted her to recognize similar traits in herself. A successful marketing executive, Powell had spent decades engaged in what researchers now call social camouflaging or masking, consciously studying and mimicking neurotypical social behaviors to navigate a world that felt foreign to her natural instincts. I maintained a literal script book, she reveals. I wrote down phrases people used in different social situations and practiced them in the mirror. I timed my laughs to match others. I forced myself to make eye contact even though it felt like being stabbed with tiny daggers. I learned to perform normal so well that no one, not even me, realized I was acting. This phenomenon of masking represents one of the most significant recent discoveries in autism research. Studies suggest that many autistic individuals, particularly girls and women, develop sophisticated compensation strategies that effectively hide their autism from others and sometimes even from themselves. Dr. William Torres, who studies gender differences in autism presentation at UCLA, explains, historically, our understanding of autism was based almost exclusively on observations of boys. But it turns out that socialization and gender expectations create profound differences in how autism manifests behaviorally. Research indicates that girls face stronger social pressure to conform and often have stronger inherent social motivation, leading many to develop elaborate camouflaging strategies. This explains one of the most persistent autism statistics, the approximately 4-to-1 male-to-female diagnostic ratio. However, when researchers use measures that look beyond behavior to underlying cognitive patterns, that ratio narrows significantly. We're now recognizing that autism in girls often looks completely different than our textbook definitions. Torres continues. The fixated interests might be in socially acceptable areas like literature or animals rather than train schedules. The social difficulties might present as being overly formal or having intense but unstable friendships rather than social isolation. This understanding helps explain how autism remained hidden for so long. Many autistic individuals, particularly those with average or above-average intelligence, learn to adapt their external behaviors while still experiencing the world differently internally. The cost of this masking, however, can be severe. Studies show significantly higher rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout among autistic individuals who camouflage extensively. Many describe the exhaustion of maintaining a neurotypical facade as like acting in a play where you don't know the script, don't understand the motivations of your character, and are never allowed to leave the stage. The recognition of masking has led to profound reconsiderations in how autism is identified. We're moving away from simply observing behavior toward asking about internal experience, explains Dr. Norton. Do you find social interaction exhausting even if you're good at it? Do you need to consciously analyze social situations that others seem to navigate intuitively? These questions often reveal autism that behavioral observation alone would miss. This evolving understanding has contributed significantly to rising diagnosis rates, particularly among adults who spent decades developing compensation strategies so effective they disguise their autism even from themselves. In 2007, journalist Roy Richard Grinker published Unstrange Minds, a groundbreaking examination of how autism is perceived across different cultures. Grinker, an anthropologist whose daughter is autistic, documented how the very concept of autism varies dramatically between countries and cultural contexts. In some rural communities in South Korea, for instance, he found that developmental differences were often attributed to family ancestral spirits, or simply considered personality variations rather than medical conditions. In France, psychoanalytic traditions led to autism being conceptualized primarily as a psychological reaction to maternal detachment. In the United States, the strong emphasis on social skills in educational settings made autism more visible and problematic than in cultures where social conformity was less emphasized. Autism doesn't exist in a vacuum, Grinker wrote. It exists within cultural systems that determine what kinds of behaviors are concerning, what constitutes disability, and what requires intervention. This cultural lens helps explain another aspect of the autism surge. Society itself has changed in ways that both highlight autistic traits and make them more challenging to manage. Consider how social expectations have evolved over just a few generations. In the 1950s, success in many professions required a relatively narrow set of clearly defined social rules. Office interactions were formal and structured. Many jobs required minimal teamwork or emotional labor. Today's workplace, by contrast, often demands constant collaboration, unstructured social navigation, emotional intelligence, and adaptability to changing social dynamics. Modern life has become increasingly challenging for those with social cognitive differences, explains sociologist Dr. Margaret Chin. The economy has shifted from valuing concrete, predictable skills to prioritizing what are essentially the opposite of autistic strengths. Rapid context switching, intuitive understanding of unspoken social rules, and comfort with ambiguity. Technology has similarly transformed social expectations. Previous generations didn't need to navigate the complex unwritten rules of social media, manage multiple digital communication platforms each with their own social norms, or process the overwhelming sensory and social information of our hyper-connected world. Even educational settings have evolved to emphasize group work, class discussions, and social learning, all potential challenges for autistic students who might have excelled in the more structured, individual learning environments of previous eras. We've essentially created a world that pathologizes autistic traits more than ever before, notes Dr. Chun. Someone who might have been considered simply bookish or detail-oriented in 1950 might today be flagged for autism assessment because those same traits now cause more functional impairment in a world demanding greater social flexibility. This doesn't mean autism is new or increasing. Rather, that the social environment has changed in ways that make autism more visible and more consequential. At the same time, cultural awareness of autism has skyrocketed. Television shows feature autistic characters. Social media platforms host vibrant autistic communities. Schools implement autism awareness programs. This increased visibility creates a feedback loop. Greater awareness leads to more recognition, which leads to more diagnoses, which leads to greater awareness. The result is a profound cultural shift in how we perceive neurological differences, one that makes visible what was previously hidden in plain sight. Despite mounting evidence that most of the autism increase stems from recognition rather than actual prevalence changes, important questions remain. Could environmental factors be contributing to some real increase alongside the diagnostic expansion? The answer reveals the extraordinary complexity of autism's origins. Dr. Norton is carefully measured on this point. The science suggests the vast majority of the increase, perhaps 80–90%, is explained by broader diagnostic criteria, greater awareness, and diagnostic substitution. But we cannot completely rule out some actual increase due to environmental factors. Understanding this requires disentangling autism's complex causation. Research has consistently shown that autism is among the most heritable of all neurodevelopmental conditions, with genetic factors explaining an estimated 60–90% of autism risk. Over 100 genes have been implicated, most involved in early brain development and neuronal communication. Autism is not one condition with one cause, explains Dr. Jennifer Martinez, neurogeneticist at the Center for Autism Research. It's likely hundreds of different genetic variations that converge on related brain systems, resulting in similar observable traits. These genetic foundations explain why autism appears across human history and all human cultures. However, genes don't tell the complete story. Evidence suggests various environmental factors may interact with genetic predispositions. Advanced parental age, particularly paternal age, shows consistent associations with increased autism risk, likely due to greater genetic mutations in sperm produced later in life. Certain prenatal factors, including maternal infections during pregnancy, exposure to specific medications like valproic acid, and extreme prematurity, show small but significant associations. Other proposed environmental culprits have proven more controversial. Despite extensive research, no credible evidence links vaccines to autism development. A scientific consensus established through multiple large-scale epidemiological studies across different countries and populations. Endocrine-disrupting chemicals, air pollution, and certain pesticides have shown some associations in ecological studies, but direct causal relationships remain elusive. The challenge lies in separating correlation from causation, especially given autism's complex genetic foundations. What we're increasingly understanding is that autism likely results from the interaction of genetic vulnerability and environmental influences during critical developmental windows, explains Dr. Martinez. Your genetic makeup might create predisposition, but environmental factors may determine whether and how those genetic vulnerabilities express themselves. This gene-environment interaction model helps explain several puzzling aspects of autism. Why, for instance, do identical twins show high but not perfect concordance for autism? Environmental differences, even in the womb, may modify how shared genetic vulnerabilities manifest. This understanding has significant implications for interpreting autism trends. If autism results from complex interactions between genes and environment, then some environmental changes could theoretically influence actual prevalence. However, the magnitude of the observed increase, more than tenfold in 3 decades, is simply too large to be explained by environmental factors alone, especially given autism's strong genetic foundations. What about theories suggesting modern exposures like processed foods, screen time, or environmental toxins are driving an epidemic? While these factors might influence other aspects of child development, the historical and anthropological evidence of autism's consistent presence throughout human history contradicts the notion that modern exposures are creating autism where none existed before. When people ask if environmental factors cause autism, they're asking the wrong question, suggests Dr. Norton. The more accurate question is whether certain environmental factors might shift someone from just below to just above the diagnostic threshold on what is actually a continuous spectrum of traits. This nuanced understanding helps reconcile seemingly contradictory evidence. Autism has likely always existed at roughly current rates, but subtle environmental influences might be influencing exactly where individuals fall on the spectrum of autistic traits. One of the most revolutionary discoveries in autism research received remarkably little public attention when it was published in 2001. Psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen and his colleagues at Cambridge University developed what they called the Autism Spectrum Quotient, AQ, a questionnaire measuring autistic traits in adults with normal intelligence. When they administered this measure to the general population, they found something startling. Autistic traits existed on a continuous distribution throughout the population. Everyone, it seemed, had some autistic traits. Some people had many, others had few. But there was no clear dividing line between autistic and not autistic, just a spectrum of traits that existed in varying degrees in everyone. This finding fundamentally challenged how we conceptualize autism, explains Dr. Norton. It suggested autism might not be a discrete, categorical condition, but rather one extreme of normally distributed human neurocognitive variation. Subsequent research has strongly supported this dimensional view. Studies examining relatives of autistic individuals consistently find elevated autistic traits, not enough to qualify for diagnosis but significantly more than average. Brain imaging studies show similar patterns of neural connectivity in individuals with high autistic traits but no diagnosis as those seen in diagnosed autism, just to a lesser degree. This understanding parallels how we've come to think about other human traits. Height, intelligence, and extroversion all exist on spectrums where we only label the extremes. We don't pathologize being very tall, but we recognize it as a statistical deviation from the mean that might bring both advantages and challenges. The dimensional view suggests autism represents one normal variation in human neurocognitive development, explains Dr. Eliza Thompson, neurodiversity researcher. Every human brain must balance competing priorities. Focusing narrowly versus thinking broadly, systematizing versus empathizing, stability versus flexibility. Autistic brains simply prioritize certain cognitive strategies, often at the expense of others. This framework helps explain why many autistic traits correlate with specific strengths. Detail-focused processing, while potentially overwhelming in some contexts, enables pattern recognition abilities that drive scientific discovery and technological innovation. Social communication challenges may coexist with heightened abilities in logical reasoning, music, or mathematics. Sensory sensitivities that make loud environments unbearable might also enable detection of subtle details others miss. Silicon Valley provides a compelling case study of this phenomenon. The technology industry shows notably higher rates of autism and autistic traits than the general population. Companies like Microsoft and SAP have even created specific hiring programs targeting autistic talents in software testing, data analysis, and cybersecurity. We're gradually recognizing that these aren't deficits with compensatory strengths, notes Dr. Thompson. Rather, they're different but equally valid cognitive styles that bring both advantages and challenges, depending on the environment. This dimensional understanding raises profound questions about where we draw diagnostic lines. If autistic traits exist throughout the population, who qualifies as autistic versus simply quirky or introverted? Current diagnostic approaches focus on functional impact, whether these traits significantly impair daily functioning. But functional impact itself depends heavily on environment. The same traits that might be disabling in a highly social, unpredictable environment might be neutral or even advantageous in a structured, predictable one. This helps explain another aspect of rising diagnosis rates. As awareness increases, More people with milder traits who experience significant challenges in our increasingly social world seek diagnosis and support. The current increase partly reflects individuals just above and below the diagnostic threshold shifting across that somewhat arbitrary line, explains Dr. Norton. Greater awareness means more borderline cases are being recognized, while simultaneously, our social environment makes those borderline traits more impairing than they might have been in previous generations. This dimensional understanding doesn't invalidate autism as a diagnosis. Many individuals experience significant challenges that warrant support and accommodation. But it fundamentally challenges the notion of autism as something that happens to a small, distinct subset of humanity rather than a continuous dimension of human neurocognitive variation. In 1998, an Australian sociologist named Judy Singer coined a term that would eventually transform how we conceptualize neurological differences: neurodiversity. Singer, herself autistic, proposed that neurological differences like autism should be recognized as normal variations in the human genome, more akin to biodiversity than to disease or disorder. This concept represented a radical departure from the prevailing medical model, which viewed autism primarily as a pathology to be treated or cured. Instead, the neurodiversity framework suggested autism represented a natural and valuable form of human diversity, with both challenges and strengths that vary based on environment. The neurodiversity paradigm doesn't deny that autism can involve genuine difficulties, explains Dr. Thompson. Rather, it suggests these difficulties arise largely from a mismatch between autistic cognitive styles and environments designed for neurotypical minds. This perspective gained momentum through the 2000s and 2010s, driven largely by autistic self-advocates who rejected the framing of their neurological differences as inherently disordered. Organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network promoted the slogan "Nothing about us without us," demanding autistic inclusion in research, policy, and services affecting the autistic community. The neurodiversity movement's influence has grown substantially in recent years. Major companies like Microsoft, Google, and SAP have implemented neurodiversity hiring initiatives. Universities have established support programs that focus on accommodating, rather than normalizing, autistic students. Even clinical approaches have shifted toward helping autistic individuals build on strengths rather than just mitigating challenges. This cultural shift contributes significantly to rising diagnosis rates. As autism becomes increasingly framed as a difference rather than a deficit, the stigma associated with diagnosis diminishes. Individuals who might previously have avoided assessment now actively seek identification with a community that validates their experiences. I regularly see adults who've struggled their entire lives without understanding why, notes Dr. Pierce. The neurodiversity framework offers them not just explanation but affirmation, the recognition that their minds work differently, not deficiently. This perspective shift has particular resonance for those with milder presentations who might have gone undiagnosed in previous eras. As autism awareness campaigns emphasize the diversity of the spectrum, more individuals recognize their own experiences in these broader descriptions. The neurodiversity paradigm also helps explain why autism seems suddenly ubiquitous. As society begins recognizing autism as part of normal human variation rather than a rare disorder, we naturally start noticing it more frequently. It's like when you learn a new word and suddenly hear it everywhere, explains Dr. Norton. The word was always there, you just lacked the framework to notice it. Similarly, as our culture develops language and concepts around neurodiversity, we start recognizing patterns of difference that were always present but previously unacknowledged. This cultural reframing has profound implications beyond diagnosis rates. It suggests the apparent autism explosion might represent not just improved recognition but an evolution in how humanity understands neurological difference itself. A shift from a binary model of normal versus disordered toward recognition of the rich tapestry of cognitive styles that comprise human diversity. When Benjamin Neal received his autism diagnosis at age 38, he experienced what he describes as a complete reframing of my life story. A software engineer with a successful career but lifelong social and sensory challenges, Neal had spent decades developing elaborate coping strategies without understanding why certain aspects of life remained so difficult. I'd built this narrative that I was just bad at being human, he explains. The diagnosis replaced that with a different understanding. I'm not defective. I'm different. And those differences come with both challenges and strengths. Neil's experience illustrates why diagnosis, even later in life, can prove transformative. Beyond access to formal supports and accommodations, diagnosis often provides a framework for self-understanding that reduces shame and increases self-advocacy. Research supports these benefits. Studies examining adults diagnosed with autism in adulthood consistently find improvements in self-esteem, reduced anxiety, and better quality of life following diagnosis. Many report that understanding their neurological differences allows them to stop blaming themselves for social miscommunications or sensory sensitivities that previously seemed like personal failings. For children, early diagnosis opens doors to appropriate educational approaches and accommodations. Rather than being labeled as behavioral problems, distracted, or unmotivated, children with autism diagnoses can receive tailored supports that work with rather than against their neurological differences. The right supports don't try to make autistic children neurotypical, explains educational psychologist Dr. Rebecca Marshall. They create environments where autistic cognitive styles can flourish while providing scaffolding for areas of difficulty. This focus on appropriate support rather than normalization represents another significant shift in how autism is approached. Earlier intervention models often emphasized extinguishing autistic behaviors like stimming, self-stimulatory movements, or special interests. Contemporary approaches increasingly recognize these as natural expressions of autistic neurology that often serve important regulatory functions. We've moved from trying to make autistic people appear less autistic toward helping them navigate a world not designed for their neurology, explains Dr. Marshall. That's a profound shift with real implications for long-term outcomes. This evolution in support approaches has further contributed to rising diagnosis rates. As autism intervention moves away from normalization toward accommodation, parents who might previously have resisted evaluation now see diagnosis as a pathway to helpful supports rather than stigmatizing labels. The benefits extend beyond individuals to society at large. Recognizing and accommodating neurocognitive diversity allows access to unique talents and perspectives that might otherwise remain untapped. From the pattern recognition abilities that drive scientific discovery to the innovative thinking that creates technological breakthroughs, autistic cognitive styles have contributed immeasurably to human advancement. When we support neurodiversity, everyone benefits, notes Dr. Thompson. The same mind that might struggle with small talk at a cocktail party might solve complex programming problems or make brilliant scientific connections others miss. But we only access those strengths when we create environments where diverse minds can thrive. This understanding helps reframe the autism increase not as a crisis but as an opportunity, a chance to recognize and support neurological differences that have always existed but previously went unacknowledged. As our understanding of autism continues evolving, what might the future hold? Experts suggest several emerging trends that could further transform how we identify, support, and conceptualize autism. First, diagnostic approaches themselves are changing. Traditional diagnosis relies heavily on behavioral observations, which can miss autism in individuals with strong compensation strategies. Newer approaches increasingly incorporate measures of underlying cognitive differences and first-hand accounts of internal experience. We're moving toward a more phenomenological understanding of autism, one that prioritizes how individuals experience the world rather than just how they appear to others, explains Dr. Norton. This shift may further accelerate diagnosis rates, particularly among girls and women, whose autism often manifests differently than traditional descriptions based primarily on male presentations. Research consistently shows girls are diagnosed later than boys, often missing critical early supports. More nuanced diagnostic approaches may help close this gap. Technology may similarly transform autism identification. Researchers are developing digital tools that can identify subtle markers of autism through eye tracking, voice analysis, and other objective measures. These approaches promise earlier, more consistent identification that depends less on clinical interpretation. Perhaps most significantly, the neurodiversity paradigm continues gaining momentum, reshaping cultural perceptions of neurological difference. As autism becomes increasingly understood as a form of human diversity rather than pathology, the distinction between diagnosis and simply identification may blur. I can envision a future where we move beyond the binary of autistic versus not autistic toward more nuanced profiles of neurocognitive styles, suggests Dr. Thompson. Rather than a single diagnostic label, we might recognize specific patterns of strengths and challenges that inform personalized supports. This future would align with the emerging understanding of autism not as a uniform condition but as a diverse constellation of traits that manifest differently in each individual. It would acknowledge the continuous nature of autistic traits throughout the population while still recognizing that some individuals require significant support. Such an approach might ultimately resolve the apparent paradox of the autism explosion. If we understand autism as part of normal human variation rather than a distinct disorder, then the increase in identification represents not an epidemic but a progressive unveiling of human neurodiversity that has always existed. As this understanding spreads, it may transform how we structure education, employment, and social spaces. Rather than expecting all minds to function identically, we might create more flexible environments that accommodate diverse cognitive styles. Schools might offer multiple pathways for learning and expression. Workplaces might recognize that open-plan offices and constant collaboration disadvantage certain cognitive styles while structured, predictable environments disadvantage others. The ideal future isn't one where we solve autism, concludes Dr. Norton. It's one where we create a world flexible enough to allow diverse minds to contribute their unique strengths while receiving appropriate support for their challenges. The story of autism's apparent explosion reveals something profound not just about autism itself but about how human understanding shapes what we perceive. What appears to be a sudden surge in a neurological condition is, in fact, largely a dramatic shift in recognition, a collective cultural awakening to a form of human diversity that has always existed but previously went unnamed. This understanding doesn't diminish the very real challenges many autistic individuals face. Many require significant support to navigate a world designed primarily for neurotypical minds. But it fundamentally reframes how we conceptualize those challenges, not as inherent deficits but as natural variations in human neurocognitive development that become disabling primarily through mismatch with environment. The autism increase thus represents not a public health crisis but a revolution in human self-knowledge. We are witnessing the progressive recognition of a dimension of human diversity that has shaped human history, contributed to human advancement, and been part of the human story all along. When future historians examine this period, they may identify it not as an era when something went wrong with human development, but as the time when humanity began truly recognizing its own neurological diversity, when we developed the framework and language to see what was always there. The apparent explosion in autism doesn't reveal something new happening to humanity. It reveals humanity finally seeing itself more completely.